Okay guys, we're going to attempt to do some actual discussion of the assignment. The first unit you're going to do in this 2-week period is World War II. There's 3 parts to it. The run-up to World War II, basically the road to the war that ends in 1941. The home front, which is the part that if you still are tested by the state will be on the test. And then the actual battles, the war itself, the 3 parts. And so there's a series of questions to ask on the first part of this unit, the run-up to the war, and it's on Google Classroom that accompanies this PowerPoint. Okay, so the first question, define isolationism as a type of government, describe fascism. You can find all that, and if you follow along, I think you can get a pretty good gist. So I'm going to get out of the way of the screen so you can watch it while I talk about it a little bit. Of course, you'll also have the PowerPoint posted for you on Classroom. So as we know already, I think, the United States really didn't like how World War I ended. We didn't like the result. We didn't like the Treaty of Versailles. We didn't like the fact that our allies owed us money and that they were bilking Germany to get that money. We didn't like the League of Nations. We didn't like any part of it. And so for a bunch of reasons, we wanted to be isolated. And the definition of isolation is right there on the screen. You can see it. Separating the nation from the rest of the world. Trying to be an island in the middle of the world. Blocking everybody and everything else out. That's what we wanted to do, okay? Why? Why did we want to do that? Well, the answer is pretty clear, but there are 4 general reasons, and they're right there. The first one is the disillusionment after World War I. It didn't work out. The 14 points never happened. Instead, a terrible treaty happened. So that's number 1, and that was from the get-go. Because the treaty was so bad, we had an even worse fear that if we joined the League of Nations, we get tangled up with the messes these other countries were prone to get into, and before you know it, we'd be in a second world war, which turned out to be not a bad prediction. Then, as time went on, and Germany failed not once but twice, and we covered that, talking about the 1920s and the economic system, the Allies basically defaulted. They didn't pay. And so millions were left on the table that we never recovered from World War I. So we were certainly angry about that. And we figured that one reason we supported the Allies is they owed us so much money. It didn't sit well that we had anything to do with people that helped us get into the war and then never paid us what they owed us after the war. Number 3, once 1929 and the Great Depression happened, we were preoccupied with other things. As you guys now are well aware, when something takes center screen, like the coronavirus, it upsets the apple cart of everything that everybody normally does, and it makes you focus on certain things. The Great Depression was an economic coronavirus that hit hard and was ruthless in what it took down. We were preoccupied with it. We didn't care about much else. And then last, in the later 1930s, war began to break out just as we feared it would in Asia, and in Europe, and North Africa, and various places, and Germany, and Italy, and Japan seemed to be the bad guys. We don't want anything to do with these people. So for all those reasons, we don't want anything to do with anything. So a question about fascism. What is it? It's one of the terms we have gotten to in our vocab. It's a very authoritarian, militaristic, belligerent kind of country that is going to settle its issues with its army, navy, and by the 1920s and 30s with its air force. The first fascist government was in Italy with Mussolini, but the second and most fearsome one, of course, was Nazi Germany. Okay, we've seen this slide before. Why did the German reparation mess ensure the United States couldn't be truly isolated? Well, let's look at this and go over it one more time, but we can see that it failed because Germany was broken in collapse after World War I. In the middle 1920s, we sent a banker over to refinance the debt and to urge American banks to invest in Germany, and that worked for a while. And we have this chart. You've all done the chart. When the crash came in 1929, Germany stopped paying reparations, the Allies stopped paying their debt, and the whole thing collapsed. But we couldn't be totally isolated because we had to keep micromanaging this money flow for as long as it worked. We couldn't get away from them. What are a few examples of isolationism at the time? Well, in the 1930s, Congress passed a series of laws called the Neutrality Acts, or the Neutrality Laws, and they're all different, and it doesn't matter the details of them, but their main point of all three of them, you see them up there, 1935, 37, and 39, was we can't do business with any country that's at war, because if we do, we'll get tangled up in their war, and if we get tangled up in their war, next thing you know, we'll be fighting a war. So the neutrality laws were put in place for us to not be involved with anybody. Now, that's all well and good, and most Americans applauded all this. This is what we want. One of the issues was that the President of the United States, though, was not an isolationist. He was what was known as an internationalist. Believed in internationalism. And there you can see what an internationalist believed. Define internationalism was believing in the fact that trade and other interactions with other countries was better than isolating away from other countries as a way to promote peace. If you're trading partners with somebody, you probably are not going to go to war with somebody. Somebody more recently said, two countries that both have McDonald's restaurants will never go to war with each other because they have too much in common. And that's kind of what an internationalist would have thought if there had been McDonald's back in FDR's day and age. Roosevelt said, man, you think this ocean between us and Europe, or this ocean between us and Asia, is enough to keep us out of war, but it's closer than what you think, and we probably have to be careful of the bad actors out there and quarantine them away from the good actors. And we're familiar with what a quarantine means, in the past week or so, right? So we're going to isolate them from us, but not isolate ourselves from the world situation. That's what Roosevelt said. And of course, he's thinking about Germany, he's thinking about Italy, he's thinking a little bit about Japan, he's thinking about Soviet Union. So Roosevelt is most fearful about Germany, especially, and Italy, and he's fearful that a second European war is going to start. And if it does, we want no part of it, but we can't turn our back on it because the big pond, the Atlantic Ocean, isn't as big as what it seems like it might be. So a second war does break out. It does break out. It breaks out after the USSR and Germany create a treaty with each other that allows them to basically divide up Poland like it's a pizza and not go to war with each other. And in fact, as soon as they sign this treaty, the Germans attack Poland 1 week later. There you see right there the Polish cavalry being strafed by the German Air Force. It wasn't an even fight. If you'd like to look at Poland being conquered in 35 days, you can click on the link on the PowerPoint that you will have. Once Poland was conquered, Hitler turned his armies around and concentrated on attacking France and fighting against England and France. Nothing much happened for a little bit. It was called a phony war, but soon enough, They completely steamrollered France. The Germans left France and went back to England on a bunch of fishing boats as best they could. Evacuation at the port of Dunkirk. If you saw the movie a year or so ago, Dunkirk, that illustrates that. It's a good movie too, by the way. And France fell. France surrendered in June of 1940. At that point, England was the only country actually fighting against Nazi Germany. So what? That's European history. Why am I talking about it? Well, because the Battle of Britain resulted in the bombing of England, and the British were barely hanging on. And what were we doing? What were we thinking? Well, we were isolated from it, as we wanted to be, but Roosevelt, remember, is worried about it. And so he comes up with something that isn't a lie, but it's also not the truth. He trades 50 destroyers, a warship, 50 destroyers, for a couple of islands and a couple of naval bases around the world that England has. And he announces it as though he has snookered somebody by trading his 79 Chevy for a new Jeep. He got the better of the deal. Actually, what we're doing is we're giving away warships to a country that badly needs them. And he's able to sell it as a trade and not a sale, so it won't violate the neutrality law. He doesn't want to violate the neutrality law, because obviously that's illegal. This is basically an end run around the neutrality law to do something that isn't neutral, but doesn't violate the letter of the law. People could see right through it. Most people supported it because if England is using our destroyers to fight Germany, we're not fighting Germany. So it seems like a good bet. Roosevelt included, though, most Americans wanted nothing more to do with this. We wanted to be isolated. And here again, you can see the Atlantic Ocean is getting narrower and narrower. Are we really safe in this situation? What should we do? Will we get involved? Can we help not getting involved? Well, the Yanks are not coming. We're not sending troops over like we did back in 1917. And there's 3 organizations, and you ought to jot them down. What 3 U.S. organizations were begun as a reaction to and a way to deal with the war in Europe? There's 3. One said, hey, we're going to get in this war sooner or later. We might as well jump in sooner. Let's do it right now, and let's go attack Hitler. The Fight for Freedom Committee. Not much support for that kind of let's go to war because we don't have to quite yet. Nobody wanted to do that, really. The Committee to Defend America, and we'll talk more about that later, that's kind of where Roosevelt was. That's what he was supportive of. That we should help, give them some destroyers, send them some things, send them some supplies, but let's not get involved in the actual war itself. And then really the most important for the time was something called America First. America First was strictly isolationist, said we shouldn't have anything to do with any of these people, no matter what happens. The very famous pilot, Charles Lindbergh, who'd flown across the Atlantic Ocean, the first one to do a trans-ocean flight back in the 1920s, was a leader of America First. And he said we should be strictly neutral, but if we had to be friends with one of these warring countries, it ought to be Germany. Germany was going to probably win anyway. We ought to be on the winning side, and they were more organized than the English, and if we were going to have an ally, it probably ought to be Nazi Germany, not England. That's how much they didn't want to get involved in the war. Lindbergh said FDR helping England is just sliding us closer and closer to war. The problem is, Hitler was the real threat, and most Americans recognized that. So as time went on, more and more people said, you know, we don't want to get in war, but this Hitler guy is not so good. In fact, if you get your head in the sand, you may think that Hitler's okay, but he's not. It's about this time, 1940, that Roosevelt is talked into, or maybe he's easily talked into, maybe he wants to do it, running for a third term. We're about to get involved in this mess. We're not quite out of the Great Depression. Will you run again? I don't want to. Oh, yes, I will. It helped that the Republican candidate, a guy by the name of Wendell Willkie, kind of agreed with Roosevelt. We're going to have to be, if we get involved in the war, we're going to be on the side of England, and this is not a good situation, and so I agree with you. By agreeing with a guy that was extremely popular, Roosevelt was easily elected, easily. And he sets out why we're on England's side. This is important. It's on page 2, the backside page, okay? It's called the Four Freedoms, and he identified these, and you should write them down. Freedom of speech. Say anything you want. Have your own opinion. Freedom of worship. You want to be an atheist, you want to be a Catholic, you want to be Jewish, you want to be anything, you have the right to do that. Freedom from want. He's talking about the Depression, but he's also talking about people in war-torn Europe who have nothing. And freedom from fear. We should be in a secure place. We don't need countries going around invading other people, lining them up and killing them. Wrong. We are against that. And by the way, England is fighting for these things even now. So he's telling Americans, these are what we stand for, and Hitler doesn't, but England does. That's the message of these four freedoms. Things get worse in 1941 for England. And he now comes up with another scheme to do an end run around the neutrality laws without quite violating them. It was lend-lease. Basically, he said, hey, if we lend them stuff instead of selling it, they can give it back at the end of the war. Well, you can well imagine that if you send crate after crate of ammunition and the English fire off any rounds, that they're not going to go out and pick up the spent ammunition, put it back in the crate, and send it back to America. So this is a fiction. It's a way of doing something to help England without violating the law, but it's clearly not neutral. It's not neutral in its spirit. It doesn't violate the law. Though clearly not a neutrality act, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act. Well, why did they go along with it if they didn't believe in getting involved and they wanted to be isolated? Why? To assist in combating the Axis powers without actually getting into the war and fighting ourselves. Having somebody else do it, even on our dime, is a lot better than us doing it. Most Americans supported that second group I said to write down. Right there, the Committee to Defend America, because it was a way to support England, help them out, but not actually fight in the war. FDR, in his way, said, hey, it's just like lending a garden hose to my neighbor to put out his fire. If his house burns down, the sparks may make my house catch on fire. But if I give him my garden hose, he can put out his own stinking fire. I don't have to get off my back porch. And all I've done is uncoiled my hose and he's taken it away. Other than that, it hasn't cost me anything. So he sells it as an easy way to save our own skin. Turns out it's not that easy because it doesn't work, but we do start supplying England with supplies. It's at this point that the United States becomes the so-called great arsenal of democracy. It's at this point, talked about how the New Deal kind of sputtered out toward 1940-41, is this. Roosevelt says, hey, Dr. New Deal has retired. Not doing that anymore. Dr. Win the War is on the job now. We've got another thing to do. And we do. And here it is. It's not our war. America first. It is our war. Jump in. Defend America now. Any aid short of war? No. We're going to defend the Allies and defend America by not fighting. We're going to give supplies, not lives. That's the concept. And here Hitler's saying, hey, you better watch out. And Uncle Sam says, no, you better watch out. You better watch out. First, it was exclusively aid to England. In 1941, Germany invades Soviet Russia. We send aid to Russia, even though they're a communist country. Japan has invaded China. We send Lend-Lease to China. Pretty soon we're sending Lend-Lease all over the world to let others fight with our stuff so we don't have to. That's our scheme. That's our plan. That's how we're going to avoid this second war. The problem is that we get out in the middle of the ocean and we're selling stuff, quote, I just misspoke, not selling, lending stuff to England. Well, we run afoul of German warships. We declare the half of the Atlantic Ocean is basically our defense area. We can patrol it all we want. But in the end, we end up bumping into some Germans who don't like us very much for being out there and helping the British. They shoot at one ship, and in October of 1941, just a couple of months before Pearl Harbor, they sink one of our destroyers, the Reuben James, and they kill 115 Americans, the first casualties of World War II, months before the wars actually has started. And so we're ready, if necessary. We seem to be slip into war with Germany on the side of England. And when the war comes, of course, it doesn't come from Europe at all. It comes from a place that we're aware of being a problem, but our eyes are not on that situation now. It's unexpected when it actually happens. So Japan, after all this time has gone on, kind of quietly, because like I said, we've been watching what's going on in Europe, has amassed an empire in Asia. And they do three things in the course of the 1930s that take us closer to war with them without us even knowing it. One, they invade Manchuria, which is north of China. 1937, they invade China itself. 1938, they declare an empire, basically. They call it the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Should write them down, just so you know what those things were, those moves. We respond economically. We establish an embargo. What is an embargo? Okay, what is an embargo? An embargo is a refusal to trade with somebody. And as you can see from the cartoon, one of the things we embargo is petroleum. Well, how are you going to run a tank or a fighter plane or a warship without fuel? Well, you're not in the 1940s. So this irks the Japanese. We also stop exports of steel to the Japanese, and they don't like that very much either. Japan sees U.S. sanctions, it says here, as an attempt to keep the Japanese empire weak. And as such, they decide this means war. They also decide, this is an interesting guy, and even though it's American history, it's good to know about Admiral Yamamoto. Yamamoto says, we can't beat these people. They're too strong. They did ally with Germany and Italy as a part of an alliance, so the Axis